Title: Why the Strait of Hormuz is Changing Forever. Intro. It started with a flash, a military strike, and in the chaos that followed, a massive portion of the world's daily oil supply was suddenly at risk. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical energy artery, was on the verge of paralysis. But that wasn't the real story. The real story is what happened next. How the effective closure of this one waterway is redrawing the map of global power and creating economic winners and losers overnight. This is why the Strait of Hormuz is changing forever. Section 1. The world's most critical artery. To grasp the sheer scale of this crisis, you have to understand the Strait of Hormuz itself. It's a fluke of geography with staggering importance. A narrow, 21-mile-wide channel of water separating Iran and Oman, it's the only way to get from the energy-rich Persian Gulf to the open ocean by sea. Before the crisis, it was less a waterway and more a relentless conveyor belt of global energy. Day in and day out, a fleet of supertankers navigated its lanes, carrying the lifeblood of the global economy. We're talking about a staggering volume. Before the events of February 2026, around 20 million barrels of oil passed through the strait every single day. To put that in perspective, that's not 20% of all the oil the world uses, but it's about 20–25% of all the oil traded by sea, a colossal figure. And it's not just oil. The strait is also a superhighway for liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Roughly 20% of the entire global LNG trade, mostly from Qatar, journeyed through these waters. For decades, the global economy was built on a simple promise: that this artery would always remain open. Nations built their energy policies, companies built their supply chains, and markets priced goods all on the assumption of this uninterrupted flow. And where was most of this energy headed? Asia? The vast majority of the crude oil flowing through Hormuz was bound for the booming economies of China, India, Japan, and South Korea, which depended on it for their economic survival. The Strait of Hormuz wasn't just a choke point, it was the bedrock of modern globalization. And that bedrock was about to crack. Section 2. The escalation, the artery is severed. On February 28, 2026, the geopolitical chessboard was violently upended. In response to escalating regional tensions, a U.S.-Israeli air campaign targeted Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. The strikes were deeply contentious. Some international legal experts called them an illegal armed attack, while others defended them as a necessary act of deterrence or self-defense. But the consequences on the ground were immediate and absolute. Iran's response was swift and asymmetric. It didn't need to defeat a superpower in a conventional war. It just needed to make the Strait of Hormuz impassable. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings to all shipping, began laying sea mines, and started boarding and attacking vessels. The waterway wasn't closed by a single declaration, but by the creation of an undeniable no-go zone. The effect on global shipping was catastrophic. Insurance became the market's new enforcer. War risk premiums for tankers skyrocketed, becoming so expensive they were simply unavailable. Major shipping lines suspended all transits. What was once a bustling highway became a ghost town. Marine traffic data showed that tanker movement nearly halted. Reports indicated that at least 200 ships were effectively trapped inside the Persian Gulf, unable or unwilling to run the gauntlet. While most traffic stopped, tanker data showed that Iran, ironically, was able to continue exporting some of its own oil, with flows averaging over 1 million barrels a day in early March. The markets reacted with primal fear. The International Energy Agency would later call it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude, the international benchmark, surged past $100 per barrel, with analysts warning it could climb much higher if the crisis persisted. Asian LNG spot prices, suddenly starved of their Qatari supply, jumped dramatically. The world had just received the largest energy shock in modern history, and the cascade of consequences was only just beginning. CTA. This single event triggered domino effects in every sector of the global economy. But how does a crisis in one narrow strait threaten the food on your table or the stability of your job? The connections are deeper and more shocking than you might think. We'll explore that, but first, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our analysis of the events shaping our world. Section 3. The New Reality. A Cascade of Consequences. The permanent change to the Strait of Hormuz isn't just about oil prices. It's about the shattering of a system. The first and most brutal consequence was the realization that the world's energy supply had a single point of failure. In response, the International Energy Agency coordinated one of the largest ever releases of strategic petroleum reserves in history, a massive emergency measure designed to buy time. The United States led the way, releasing tens of millions of barrels from its own salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana. But strategic reserves are finite. By summer 2026, those emergency supplies would begin to run low, and the market knew it. This forced a frantic, costly scramble for alternatives. Saudi Arabia became the most critical player overnight. The kingdom activated its long underused east-west pipeline, a 746-mile steel artery built decades ago for this exact scenario. Pumping crude overland from its eastern fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, it became the primary lifeline for a market starved of Gulf oil. Aramco pushed the pipeline to its maximum capacity of around 5 million barrels per day, a monumental feat that still couldn't fully replace what was lost from Hormuz. This bypass became a critical relief valve, preventing a complete price catastrophe. But the crisis quickly leaped beyond energy. The world was about to get a brutal lesson in supply chain geography. It turns out the Strait of Hormuz is also a choke point for food. A significant portion of the world's globally traded fertilizers, the urea and ammonia essential for modern agriculture, passes through the strait. With the waterway closed, those exports stopped. This wasn't a long-term problem. It was an immediate threat to global food security. Nations heavily reliant on these fertilizer shipments faced the prospect of devastating harvest failures. Suddenly, a military conflict in the Persian Gulf was directly threatening a food crisis thousands of miles away. This exposed the fragile, hidden interconnections of our globalized world. Economists began using the term stagflation, that toxic mix of stagnant growth and high inflation, with renewed urgency. Projections for global GDP were slashed. In the United States, the pain was felt directly at the pump, with gasoline and diesel prices surging to painful new highs, hitting both household budgets and corporate bottom lines. Section 4. The Winners, the Losers, and the New Map. Every crisis creates winners and losers, and the closure of Hormuz redrew the global economic map with brutal speed. The losers were clear, and their pain was acute. The economies of East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and India had their entire economic model upended. For decades, they had built their industrial might on cheap, reliable energy from the Persian Gulf. Now, that foundation was gone. They were forced to compete for dramatically more expensive cargoes from the Atlantic, Africa, and the Americas. The winners were the energy producers outside the Persian Gulf. The United States, with its vast shale fields, suddenly found itself in an even more powerful geopolitical position. Other producers, from Canada to Brazil, saw their revenues and influence surge as nations scrambled to diversify. Even Iran, despite the damage it sustained, benefited from the soaring price of what little oil it could get to market. But the biggest long-term shift is more profound. It is a change in trust. For 50 years, the world operated on faith in the security of its most important trade routes. That faith is now shattered. The market will never again view the Strait of Hormuz as a risk-free artery. The Hormuz premium is no longer a few extra cents on a barrel of oil. It is a fundamental structural repricing of global energy, shipping, and risk itself. Conclusion. Under a fragile ceasefire, some ships have begun to transit the strait again, and traffic is partially recovering. But make no mistake, the world has changed forever. The crisis of 2026 has forced a strategic reckoning that was decades overdue. Countries and companies are now compelled to spend trillions of dollars to redesign their supply chains, diversify their energy sources, and build the resilience that was sacrificed in the pursuit of cheap, efficient globalization. Bypass pipelines will be expanded. New long-term contracts will be signed with suppliers far from the Persian Gulf. Investment in alternative energy will accelerate, not just for climate reasons, but for the urgent cause of national security. The era of the Strait of Hormuz as the undisputed stable center of the energy world has ended. It was not a slow transition, but a sudden, violent break. We now live in a world where the fragility of our interconnectedness has been laid bare. The key question for the coming decades is not if another choke point will fail, but which one will fail next, and whether we will be any better prepared for the consequences.